Well, the only thing that's really come out of this is that there is a headline that says, "We have a deal and I, Donald Trump, will need to sign off on it." So the attention all comes back to Donald Trump and his sole and individual power. But there is no substance here, and nor do I expect substance to come from this. But you need to wean yourself off Chinese dependency. You never want the Chinese Communist Party having a chokehold on any of your supply chain.
U.S. President Donald Trump announces a China-U.S. agreement to lower trade tensions, stoking hopes the economic superpowers will eventually reach a broader tariff deal. They set up a framework to move towards a pact following negotiations in Geneva last month that saw them slash tit-for-tat levies. Well, to clear this up for us, we've got China analyst Fraser Howie. He'll be talking us through the process. Fraser, thanks for joining us, but give us the headline. What did the two sides actually decide in London?
Well, the only thing that's really come out of this is that there is a headline that says, "We have a deal and I, Donald Trump, will need to sign off on it." So the attention all comes back to Donald Trump and his sole and individual power. Because you say, I can't remember, is this a pact or a framework or a framework of a pact? The reality is it's dreadfully short of details and doesn't address any of the real major concerns and ongoing concerns that America has with China, and frankly, that many countries around the world have with China.
I have to read you this quote from Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. He said, "We have reached a framework to implement the Geneva Consensus and the call between the two presidents." But how is this any different than what was decided in Switzerland?
Nothing really, and I wouldn't particularly. I don't think Howard Lutnick knows much about China, and he certainly has very limited China experience. They reached a deal allegedly in Geneva, and then it fell apart, and they have now reached largely the same terms now. Why will it not fall apart again? You have Donald Trump, who changes his mind every few days or every a few hours, depending on who he speaks to. And you have the Chinese, who are clearly going to try and play hardball for as much as they can. Clearly, they needed to wind down tensions. The level of tariffs were completely unworkable for any ongoing trade relationship. But there is no substance here, and nor do I expect substance to come from this.
Well, what I'm hearing from you is we can't necessarily decide a winner at this point. But in terms of sectors that might be breathing a sigh of relief, it seems like maybe the tech and auto sectors might be feeling a little lighter today, at least those CEOs and leaders, that is.
Well, that's true to some extent, but you then have to you still have to address the question about the challenge of Chinese EV cars, which, whether it be just on a price level, a competitiveness level, or on a surveillance security risk level. If you're in the tech space, you need to worry, is China going to steal your IP? Should America loosen restrictions on chip exports or related technologies to China? These are really serious, big problems and issues that America faces, that Germany faces as well, and other countries are going to be challenged with. This framework, and indeed, whether it be Trump, Lutnick, or Bessent, they are not the people I would trust to actually negotiate properly and understand these issues in depth.
In this current squabble, there were two critical sticking points, at least that were publicly acknowledged: semiconductors and rare earth minerals. So let's talk more about rare earths, which China has a large reserve of, but has a hands-down dominance when it comes to processing, as viewers can see here. What's China conceding on rare earths under this latest agreement?
It doesn't really seem to be conceding very much at all. And indeed, the media in the UK are reporting today that that China is now demanding that if you want to get rare earths from them, you need to disclose a lot of confidential business information about how you're going to use them, send details about the processes, your customers, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one of the real sticking points. And rare earths, although they're called rare, are found all over the world. But the processing is extremely intensive. It's very environmentally polluting. And China has basically discarded a lot of those concerns and largely got a stranglehold on processed rare earths. The question that should be asked is, what is America doing to develop its own rare earth facilities, work with allies, remember its allies of Canada and Australia? Again, tens of millions of square kilometers of land has got plenty of rare earths, but is there a commitment to invest into this to actually break China's stranglehold? That's the real problem. This is not going to address it. Simply allowing China to supply America again is not a solution to this problem.
And on the other side of the negotiating table, the big card that the U.S. wanted to play was its export controls on semiconductors. What has the U.S. given up here?
I don't think it's really given up very much, and neither should it. This is meant to be a national security issue. And indeed, when they talk about AI, this is the technology of the future, and this is the race that America must win. And so, therefore, why would you give anything up to China in this space? And certainly give intellectual property away or even share it with them when we know that China has a dreadful history and a dreadful track record in terms of intellectual property. So again, if this is really a national security issue, nothing should be given away here. Perhaps, if anything, controls should be tightened.
But is it actually a national security issue then, or is that just an excuse given by the White House?
No, I think there is genuine national security concerns here. There's obviously some nuance on these issues. It's a complicated field. It's a very complicated supply chain as well. But no, these are real. The whole question of technology, of AI, of surveillance. These are genuine security concerns, and certainly ones where you don't want China having a bottleneck or a stranglehold on any part of the process. So that's the issues that need to be addressed. And simply trading away so you can have a headline of Trump strikes deal with China is a very short-sighted and frankly disastrous policy for the West.
And in this social media post, the U.S. President Donald Trump said, "We will provide to China what was agreed to, including Chinese students using our colleges and universities." How relevant was this point for China, or was that a bit of a nothing burger?
That was very much a nothing burger. It was a nothing burger with cheese and relish and everything and all the toppings. This was an issue that Trump has completely created himself. It's got nothing to do with the trade deal. And yet there is also a real risk about intellectual property and theft and stealing of research from US universities going back to China, poor disclosure, etc. So again, this is another important China topic, which Trump is just throwing out there without understanding the nuance. And the only person who's talked about banning Chinese students or any other students is Donald Trump over the past few weeks. So again, an artificially created situation, which he's come back, he's wound down, and then somehow claims a victory.
We were wondering here in our newsroom what this means for the American deal with Ukraine, which seemed to be about rare earth minerals as well.
Well, in some ways, that's actually a sort of a positive step, but in the sense that America does need to reduce its dependency on supply of rare earths and particularly on processing of rare earths. But Ukraine's at war, and there's no sign that that war is stopping. There's no sign that Russian aggression is stopping. So this is hardly a reliable partner to try and wean yourself off China. As I said, America has deposits of rare earth, as does Canada, as does Australia, as do many other countries. Why is America and its allies not working with them and sort of biting the bullet on refining these and processing these minerals? Because that's the real problem. That's highly intensive. It's a dirty process, environmentally polluting. And that pollution, the Chinese haven't overcome those problems. They've just ignored them. But you need to wean yourself off Chinese dependency. You never want the Chinese Communist Party having a chokehold on any of your supply chain.
China's exports to the U.S. were down in May, according to some new figures out this week. And that makes me wonder, has China hit a pain threshold when it comes to trade with the United States?
Look, I think it would be foolish to say that China is not going to suffer pain. Anytime that trade becomes more problematic, it's going to affect China. Chinese exports are still very key to their economy. It employs a lot of people. It gives them a lot of clout. It keeps everybody busy within China, as it were. So there is a pain threshold there, and the tariffs are affecting China. But this is only one small part of it. We've seen time and time again that the Communist Party is not particularly interested in efficiency, it's efficacy. They're happily prepared to waste tremendous resources to get particular outcomes. And that's true in the export space as much as anywhere else. So China's not going to respond to economic drivers in the same way that perhaps other countries will.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from you then is that China hasn't necessarily felt more pain here, because there was this idea that China could stand the heat longer, that it had these tougher negotiators on its side. But did that materialize in the end? Or are we at the end? Am I at the wrong point in the story?
No, No, I don't know if that's really true. It clearly is going to suffer. They do not want mass unemployment. Clearly, exports are very important to them. So they definitely want to reduce trade tensions, and the levels of tariffs were were unworkable. Even now, if the tariffs do end up at 55%, that's pretty unworkable as well. But as I say, China's prepared to suffer a lot of waste. I don't know if pain's the right word. And this sort of rush to try and find winners and losers, I think, is the wrong approach. If you look at rare earths, this is an industry that China has been developing over decades, understanding that this is a chokehold. On the export side of things, Chinese immediate exports may be down to the States, but we know that Chinese factories are also moving into places like Vietnam and going through third countries. So that you haven't fundamentally changed any real supply chains here, and certainly what isn't happening is there isn't a vast number of factories opening in America, which is what Donald Trump also has promised to try and bring these jobs back to America. But this is very complex, and sadly, Donald Trump doesn't do complex problems.
How much of this is about economics, and how much of this is actually about geopolitics?
I think is it 50-50? Is it 60-40, 40-60? Both factors are very important. I think for, let's say certainly from around the mid-90s through to around 2010, 2015, so much of the China discussion was only economics. That if somehow the economics got better, if the investment increased, if the market opened more, that's all we needed to worry about, and the geopolitics would take care of itself. We now live in a very different world where geopolitics is much more important. China has now got an industrial capacity and a military capacity that it simply did not have 20 or 30 years ago, and therefore it's become more of a threat in the region. And obviously, Taiwan is a center point here, or a focus here. So I don't know. Both are hugely involved, and I think I think for those who've been focused solely on economics, it becomes a very difficult calculus now to factor in the geopolitics, because national security was poo-pooed for decades. That wasn't really a big concern. Don't worry, economics will trump everything. And of course, now geopolitics is much more front and center, especially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Stepping back, what does this agreement or outline of a deal or something, what does this latest chapter mean for this broader trade war?
I think the takeaway is that, Trump's, the taco trade, taco Don as he was called, Trump always chickens out, is sort of true to an extent. Whether the markets are responding in the same way as they did is almost a secondary factor. But Trump has plays this game of ramping tariffs and just throwing outrageous things out there, and clearly backs down. So it's not back to business as usual. And clearly the uncertainty around the trade war will continue. Remember, we're still basically another 3.5 years of Donald Trump. So who knows where we'll be in 6 months or a year or whatever. So the trade war or the trade disruptions will certainly continue. Does this lead to more adults coming into the room to try and actually get better deals and deeper, more meaningful deals? I just don't know. Trump's second reign is clearly very different from his first, and there seems to be a few adults in the room, and if they're certainly not in charge, because everyone just needs to show obedience to Donald Trump. That's the way you keep your job at the moment in the White House.
As we were watching these talks unfold in London and then waiting for details to emerge yesterday, a big question that I had on my mind was, have any of these underlying issues actually been solved? Because looking to the summer calendar, we have a July 9 deadline from the U.S. for many countries, and then we have this 90-day truce with China. It seems like the plates are spinning for now, but how are you looking at the near-term or maybe long-term future? What can we expect in the next few months?
Guess what? Uncertainty, that favorite word nowadays. No, none of the underlying issues have been solved regarding China. And again, this is leaving aside the nonsense and the noise and the heat of the Trump White House. Before Trump became president, there were real problems in the global economy of imbalances between countries. And we're not just talking about bilateral trade deficits. That's a very wrong measure to just look at or try and decide policy on. But China did have, through its subsidies policies, through its industrial policies, it was playing a very distorting role within global trade. That needed to be addressed. Okay, the geopolitics factor needed to be addressed. In support of Russia, its threatening behavior towards Taiwan and in the South China Sea. These are all major factors that need to be addressed long before Donald Trump came back to the White House. And I've seen very little sort of effort to really address those issues. You know, one of the things today in the headlines is that AUKUS may be getting reviewed, this pact between America, Australia, and the UK. Now, that's not a game changer, as it were, but when that was brought in, it clearly showed that the US and its allies were looking at new and sort of innovative ways to try and, you know, contain China and at least push back on China and say, look, we're watching you. You're not going to get a free rein in the Pacific or in South China Sea. And by tearing up these agreements, all your weakening of his alliances does not seem to be the best way to be challenging China.
Fraser Howie, thanks for clearing that up for us here at DW.